in this video, we're going to start talking about React hooks. So we're going to learn what are hooks, how do we use hooks, and we're going to start looking at the state hook in React. So let's jump right in. So first, we're going to talk about what is a hook. And we have a simple definition here inside of the Notion guide. So a React hook is a function that is going to allow us to use some of the features in React inside of a functional component. Before functional components, we were only able to use state inside of class components, and we only were able to initialize state as an object, and then that object could contain different values. But since the introduction of hooks, we have a much simpler way to initialize hooks. And we can now initialize hooks to simple data types like a Boolean, a string, a number, or anything you want. You can also use an array or a object. You can still use an object, of course. So let's open up the state started code sandbox here. So let me copy the link and open a new tab so we can see what are hooks and how we can use hooks in React. So let me make this a little smaller. So let's take a look at what is a React hook. The first one we're going to look in this lesson is going to be the React state hook. So we could just import. Let me import it all the way at the top. We're going to import curly brackets so we can use from React. So we can import just the useState. So inside the curly brackets here, we're going to import the useState hook. Notice the names for hooks, they all start with use and then the name of the hook that you want to use. So useState, we're also going to have useEffect, useRef, useMemo. So this one is the state hook. So first we need to import the hook inside of the component. Then as soon as we do that, we can start defining a new piece of state or a new state variable. So in here, we're going to declare a new state. We're going to use the keyword const and then an array because we need to destructure two values from the state hook. And the state hook, which is a function, you can see that we're calling the function here. We can pass a initial value to this function. So initialize the value to, let's say for example, we can just initialize it to the value of a Boolean. Let's just initialize it to true. And inside of the array, we're going to destructure. This useEffect hook is going to return the state variable. We can call this one, let's call it loading and set loading. Right? You're always going to get the state variable, which is going to be whatever value you assign, you pass as the initial value here. So this loading is going to have the value of true. And then you're going to have a function that is going to allow you to update the value of inside of this variable. So state is pretty much a representation of some data that is going to change over time inside of your application. For example, here we're initializing a new state variable called loading, and we're going to initialize it to true. So in this example, let's say if we have a loading variable, we could do something that we can have a if statement here, right? And we can say if is loading, if loading is true, we want to return an h1 with the message saying loading, saying our application is loading, for example. Loading. right? So as you can see in the browser here, we initialize this loading variable to true, and we place the if statement before the return keyword. So this is checking if it's loading. I want it to return a h1 with the message loading here. Right, let's say for example we are getting some data from a backend or from some API, and the data is not available right away. Let's say it's going to take a couple of milliseconds in order to get the data from the backend, and then we can render the data in the JSX. We could have something like this where we check in, we have a variable called loading. First, we want to display a message. It could be like a loading component or something to display like the application is in waiting for something. And then we could, as soon as that data comes back, we can update the value of loading, and we can set it to false. So you can skip the if statement, and then it's going to return the JSX from here. So the cool thing about state is that, let's put a set timeout here. Set timeout. And what we're going to do with set timeout, we are going to call the set loading function. We're going to set it to false, and we're going to wait for 3 seconds, right? So after 3 seconds, we're calling the set loading, and we're going to set it to false, right? So if I save this, and let me refresh it just in case this is 1, 2, 3, set loading, and now it's not working because I need to put this all the way at the top here. Let me put it at the top. All right, there we go. So the set timeout is going to wait 3 seconds, and after 3 seconds, we're going to call the function to update the loading, right? These two are bind together. So we can use this function to update the value of loading to false. We pass in the value of false. That is going to become false. And the cool thing about React state is that as soon as you update the state variable, right, your React application is going to re-render your application. Is going to re-render the sections of your app that where the data change, is going to re-render those components. Right now we're just working in the app.js component, so it's going to re-render just the entire app.js. But later we're going to create a separate component, and we're going to have also state in there. So to recap a little bit, we initialize a new piece of state, right? We have a loading variable at the beginning, has the value of true, and we have a function that is going to allow us to update the value of loading, right? So we have an if statement that is checking if this is true, if loading is true. We want to show a message that says loading, and if it's false, we want to continue and render this h1 with the state counter app, as we can see here. So we set a set timeout to wait 3 seconds, and then we change or update the value of loading from true to false after 3 seconds, or 300 milliseconds, just 3 seconds. So if I refresh this browser again, we can see it again, loading 1, 2, and 3, and then it changes to the value gets updated to false, and then it renders the application here. Also, we have here the React DevTools, which is going to allow you to check the pieces of state that are defined on your app component, right? As you can see here, you can click on the app component. You can see that we have hooks, we have the state is set to false, and here we can also see the props, right? We can also see the props here. In the next app that we're going to build, we're going to use more of the DevTools. So I just wanted to show you that here because I wanted to refresh this here so we can see the value change in here for the state. So if I click refresh, it might show us, it might not. Let's try that again, refresh. click on this, and it's not working properly here, but normally you will be able to see the different values inside of the DevTools. We're going to use the DevTools a little bit more in the upcoming lessons, but this is what's happening right now. We set it to well, it's set to true. So this was working fine. I got a little bit of, so this is true first. And then when you change this to false is when it's not showing it. So if we click away, maybe it's not showing us there, but it should be changed to false after this 3 milliseconds goes by. So right now we have a loading. We can also, let's say you can have multiple values, multiple states. So you can also create, let's say, const user and then set user, right? Always you have your state variable and then your function. So the functions, we always call it like set and then the name of the variable here. So in here, we're trying to create a new user state variable, which is going to hold, let's say, nothing at the beginning, no, right? There's no user at the moment, right? No user. Is this initialized to no? We got the value here. And now if we take a look at the DevTools, click on app, it's not showing me again. This DevTools sometimes is not the best, doesn't work the best right away. Here we go. Now we have the state set to true, and we have another piece of state which is set to no, which is our user state, right? So to do something similar to what we did here in the set timeout, we can also do, let's say in here, we want to have a message after the H1. We want to say H2. Let's close the H2 and say hello. And then we want to use the user here, right? So user right now is set to no because we don't have a value for it. And you can see it is only displaying hello at the moment. So we could leave it like this. Just keep it like this for now. If I save it, okay. So we can also have a set timeout. Set timeout. And the set timeout, we can pass a function here. And we want to set user. We're gonna call the update function again after 300 milliseconds. And we wanna set the user to, let's say, Mike. Right? So if we refresh at the beginning, we see loading. When the time passes, we can see at the beginning we initialize it to no, but after 300 milliseconds or 3 seconds, we also update the user variable using the set user function and passing the value of Mike. If we click on the app and we take a look at, it's not giving me the latest values. Again, let me see if I can refresh this somehow. No, it's not giving me the updated value, but normally this works fine. Right now it's okay. We are though updating those values, right? First we initialize the load into true, then we change it to full after 300 milliseconds. The user, we initialize it to no, and then after 300 milliseconds or 3 seconds, we pass the value of Mike. And first we saw the loading message, and then we were able to see the hello and then the username here. Right, so state is going to allow you to create or store data that is supposed to change over time, right? Loading is set to true at the beginning, but then later is going to change to, let's say, false, or user is going to change from no to a string. So the cool thing again is that when you update any of these variables, your components get re-render, right? The component that changed is going to get re-render and is going to display the new data. So we don't need to before we don't need to directly go to the element and update the element with the new data. All you have to do is update that piece of state or that state variable, and React is going to make sure the components get re-render and display the new data. Another quick example that we can do now that we have now that we know about click events, we can create a new folder here. Let's call it components. Inside components, I want to create a new file. Let's call it counter.js. Let's do a quick counter component. Let's create a function called counter. And let's return a paragraph. No, let's put a div first. Let's return a paragraph, which is going to say count. Let's close the paragraph. Let's close the div. And also we want to export default counter, so we can import it inside of the app.js. Before we do that, we want to also have a button. This button is going to say increment, so we can increment the value of the counter or the count. So if we have this component, we can bring it inside of the app.js. We can import counter from that /components/counter in here. So now what we can do, we can display this counter component. Let's display it after the h2, just like this. We can see the word count, and we have a button that says increment in here. So what I want to have a state variable, which is going to hold the data of the count. So at the top, let's import the useState hook from React. Inside of the function, we're going to initialize the state variable. We're going to call it count, or yeah, count is fine, and then set count equals the return value of calling useState, and we're going to initialize this to the value of 0, now a number, right? We could use the count to display the count in here, so curly brackets and then count. Right, our app is loading, 3 milliseconds. Now we can see the count, and we pass in the initial value, which is 0. Right, let's now that's fine. Now that we have a button, right, this is 0, but we need to update this value. We need to update the count because it's initially set to 0, but we want to be able to click on this button, and we want to call the set count to increase the value from the count state variable. So what we are going to do, let's do it similar to what we did in the click event lesson. We're going to listen for a onClick here. And on the onClick, we're going to call a function that we're about to define. We're going to call it handle increment. And let's declare that function here. So const handle increment. We initialize that here. And every time we click on this button, right, on the increment, we want to update the value of count. So what we can do, we can call the set count, and we can pass the value of count plus 1, right? We could do this here. So if we save our app and then we click on increment, we can see how every time we click, the value of count increments and your component is being re-rendered, your counter component, because your counter component, you're updating the state, and that is what is allowing the new data to be displayed. So every time you click, it's so fast that you don't even believe that this is happening, but it is happening. Every time you update the count value, your React is going to update the counter component, right? You can keep clicking on this and increment as much as you want. So this is one way to doing it. You also have access to the previous value of count, which you can do by, let's say we can delete the count plus 1 from there. We can receive a function in here. We can set previous value, pre-value, and then a function like this. You can do previous value plus 1. Or we can also update the value this way. So let's give it a quick refresh. We get the loading, 3 milliseconds, and we get the application render. And if you click increment, it also works. This is another way. If you need the previous value before the component re-renders, you can also access it from there. But as we had it, is also you're also able to do it that way. We will see when this is useful to do it this way, but right now all we have to do is just count plus 1, and that is going to work just fine. Right, so this is really cool. Every time you update it, your React components get re-rendered. Also, about state. State is usually confusing to understand, and especially when you talk about props and state. So remember that props is data that's being passed from one component to another one, and that data is immutable. You're not allowed to update that data that is being passed from one component to another one, right? So that data is going to remain the same. It's just there. The props is just to pass the data to another component. But state is for data that we need to track. It's for data that we need to track every time it changes. Every time the data changes, we want to render the new value of the data. So state is for new data. Props is just for data that is immutable, that is being passed from one component to another one. And last thing about state for now is that state, let's say right now we only have one counter component, but you can render as many components as you want, right? Now we have 1, 2, 3, let's just keep it at 3 instances, right? 3 instances of the counter component. And each one of these is going to manage its own state, right? If I click increment here, each one of these instances is going to keep their own state encapsulated to each instance, right? The counter here, now the count is 2, and this one is 1, this one is 6. You can also see it here. You can see that the app is rendering 3 counter components now. And the counter component, it has a state, which is not displaying the right data, but this is because it's probably loading and it's getting an error. But here you can see it. You can see that count for the first instance the count is 2 at the moment. If you keep clicking, it manages its own state. It remembers the count just for that component. Every time you click, only this component gets updated. If you update this one gets updated, and it manages its own state. Same for the third one here. So that is really cool, because each one of these, you can have as many instances as you want, and each one of these counter instances are going to manage its own separate state. right? So that's it for now. On the state hook, we're going to see a few more hooks before we move to trying to build a bigger application. So that's it for now. I'll see you in the next video.